Okie dokie. So hi and welcome to our very first speaker event for this month. We are going to be honoring AAPI and mental health awareness. So here we have Cynthia Choi. She is the co-founder of Stop AAPI Hate and Chinese Affirmative Action. And we're honored to have her here today. So thank you and take it away.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor, really, to be presenting. I have had a lifelong love affair with libraries, public libraries. From the time that I was little, my siblings and I would go to libraries after school because my parents both worked. And it is where I discovered the love of books and learned that you could check out games and that librarians and people who worked at libraries were more than, had multiple jobs, wore multiple hats. They were social workers, they were technologists, they were all so many things to so many families. And I continue that with my three daughters, who, wherever we go, whatever city we are, they're always like, there's a library, because it brings so much joy. So thank you so much for having me, and happy Asian, Pacific, American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander Heritage Month. And also the fact that I want to acknowledge that it is also mental health awareness, and I'm going to be integrating that as part of my talk as well. Okay, so with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and just a thumbs up to can everybody see that? Okay. So, today what I want to talk about is unfortunately a unprecedented levels of hate that our community has been experiencing. And what I want to do today is to really provide for everyone an understanding of the nature of the hate during this time, but also to explain what some of the reasons behind it, that of course it's not new, and what we're doing about it. And we are, I'm representing our partners who started Stop AAPI Hate, but also a movement that has existed for quite some time, including my organization that's over 50 years old. So again, let's go ahead and get started. So just a little bit about Stop AAPI Hate. We've only been around for since March of 2020. So even though all of the partners have been involved, we collectively have over 150 years of experience. The reporting center, Stop AAPI Hate, and our coalition started when we started witnessing through media and social media accounts that members of our community were being racially profiled, targeted, and harmed. And so we started Stop AAPI Hate, and our mission is to advance equity, justice, and power by dismantling systemic racism and building a multiracial movement to end anti-AAPI hate. So that's very simple, and it's hopefully something that everyone can support. Our core strategies are, of course, our data and research. So we are a platform that collects firsthand accounts by members of our community. We use that data to advocate for policy change. We want to make sure that our movement continues to be strong, and the power of narrative. So again, as librarians, as libraries, in terms of storytelling, making sure that people have accurate information and that it's more inclusive. Obviously, I'm sure you can appreciate the power of story and narrative. So one of the things that I wanted to do immediately was to talk about what does COVID-19 racism look like? And it was very important for me to really highlight the fact that behind each data point is a person. And so I wanted to just offer that some of these words that I'm going to say are traumatizing, excuse me, and harmful. So I did want to just offer a trigger warning. But I wanted to read to you some examples, just so you can, again, really experience the kind of hate that people who reported on our site experience. So I was discriminated against my own bosses and coworkers, along with customers. I was told to go back to my country or that I would give them COVID. I would even get death threats from customers, and they would tell me to kill myself or they would kill me. White male struck me as I was walking through the aisle of a hardware store and verbally attacked me, saying, "Shut up, you monkey, F you Chinaman, go back to China," and bringing that China virus over here. A middle school child was physically attacked and verbally assaulted. On the schoolyard, a bully accused him of having COVID-19 and told him to go back to China. When the child responded that he was not Chinese, he was punched in the head 20 times. And then my elderly parents were walking with my 2-year-old, and some 20 to 30-year-olds drove by and screamed, "F China," at the stoplight. They felt very unsafe. I wanted to also highlight, because a majority of our respondents are women, what does racism look like directed at women? And so first example was my 10-year-old daughter was in school and picked up a piece of paper off the floor, not knowing whose it was. A girl came up to her, came up behind her and said, "Don't touch that. You're a Chinese girl. You have coronavirus." A man approached me and said, "F you, you slanted eye Asian B word." As I walked away and looked back to see if he was following me, he said, "I will pay $500 for someone to punch your Asian B word face." And finally, I was sent a postcard to my workplace at community college. A staff person in the mailroom alerted me by email that I received a disturbing postcard. The postcard said, "F you, you cheap Korean B word whore." And it was addressed to me and my department. So first I want to take a moment and just ask people, just take a deep breath, because I think words are very harmful. And they have this traumatizing effect. And of course, we're all affected by the news, a series of tragic headlines. And so just want to just acknowledge that. And I still have a hard time reading those incidents. So what I wanted to share is that since March of 2020 through December 31st of 2021, we've received close to 11,000 acts of hate against our community. And what's important to note is that we have close to 40% of these incidents coming from California. So despite our significant populations here, California is not immune, but they're coming from all 50 states. So it is pervasive, it's systemic, and it's something that we have to recognize is not isolated. As I mentioned before, over 60% of the incidents are coming from reported by women. And I want to make sure to be careful with that statistic, because in no way do I want to suggest that men don't experience and encounter racism and discrimination. And it may be that women are more comfortable or more likely to report. So that might be a factor. And then close to 76% of incidents are taking place that are in spaces that are open to the public. And so we took a closer look at that. What was actually happening? So what we saw is that, again, a majority of the incidents were taking place in spaces that are open to the public parks and streets, and in private businesses and on public transit. And the types of discrimination and hate that we saw, you could see the number one form of hate is verbal harassment. And for those of you who have been subjected to that, um, even though it's not a crime, even though it's not something we would want to criminalize, I think we can all attest to how hurtful, how traumatic that can be. Um, uh, to have racial epithets, homophobic statements, sexualized remarks. So I don't want to minimize that. A majority of the incidents that we've received are actually not hate crimes. And so what we wanted to do was we looked at, closely at that and determined that because there has been such a focus, I think, in the media of horrific incidents, in New York, in San Francisco, and other places, that there has this, it's had this effect where it makes us feel so unsafe and that our lives are in danger. And we want to recognize that harm, but also provide people with the facts that it's also the everyday racism, whether it's criminal or not, that is having an effect, on our community. So one of the things that we wanted to lift up is that there are actual resources and laws that protect us. So for example, in the state of California, we have what we call the UNRRA Civil Rights Act. And so in the state of California, you cannot be discriminated against in terms of um, public establishments denying or refusing you service based on your ethnicity, race, gender, religion. And so this is one of the things that we do is a lot of education about, first of all, that there are protections, and also the Department of Fair Employment and Housing is a place that you can go to say, this is something that's happened. You don't have to have a lawyer. You don't have to have resources to be able to have these issues addressed. And so that's something I think is really important to offer to the community. One of the things that I think has happened too is that in the state of California, we advocated for historic investments to address hate in the state, and not just against the Asian community, but any group that's being targeted. So over $166 million going to violence prevention, victim services, doing ethnic media engagement. And again, this is for any group that's being targeted, not just the Asian community. And we also have bills that are really focused on addressing street harassment. So we have bills that are focused on businesses where we see customer on customer discrimination. We also have one on ending street harassment. This is an issue, obviously, prior to the pandemic, where we have basically tolerated street harassment against women and other vulnerable populations, even though this street harassment is a public health crisis. The fact that women and other vulnerable populations navigate their lives knowing that they are likely to, when they walk on the street, take public transportation, um, are likely to be harassed or may be harassed. And that's something that we're trying to address as well. And then finally, on public transportation, there are so many people who depend on public transportation who encounter harassment as well. And so we are trying to hold our transit agencies responsible for developing safety plans. What are they doing to make sure that when you're trying to go to school or go to work or to care for your families, that we have a safe experience. And of course, not everybody can take a private car. Not everyone has the luxury to order Lyft or Uber. And so we have to make sure that, public transit is safe for everyone. Oh, I'm having problems with my slides. My apologies here. Let me just restart that again. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Take your time.
Thank you. Okay. Oh, this has never happened to me before. Okay, here we go. Okay, so let me start that again. Thank you so much for your patience. Okay, so I wanted to get behind some of the reasons for what is happening and why it's happening. It's not, an accident. So one of the things that we saw in our reporting is that what contributed to the scapegoating and targeting of the Asian community is US-China relationships. So as many know, we have a very hostile relationship between China, the government, and we've had politicians use racist rhetoric to that's conflated the fact that we have tense relationships with China. So anytime there's kind of anti-China statements, it implicates people in the United States. And this happens to other communities as well. Conflict with Mexico or in Latin America and in other parts of the country where we've had elected officials use racist rhetoric that again gives people license. So when we saw the kinds of attacks that our communities experience, three things that showed up was scapegoating, racist statements, and anti-immigrant statements. So again, when you have elected officials and people who are in powerful places using that kind of racist or anti-immigrant rhetoric, again, it gives license and it creates a very hostile environment, for our community. So just some headlines, some examples. I know a lot of people point to the former president, but let's be honest that there has been a tradition of our president and other elected officials scapegoating, blaming, and deflecting their own responsibilities and painting us as a threat. And other elected officials claiming that Asians should be banned, specifically Chinese students should be banned, or we have Chinese here who are a threat to our national security. And again, we're not the only community. We have others from Muslim majority countries that have been painted as a threat, as terrorists. We have members of the Latinx community who are being blamed for quote unquote taking away jobs, being part of the drug cartel. All of these kinds of racist rhetoric that is again allowing people to really attack and verbally harass members of our community. We also have to point to our immigration policies. So right now we are deporting members of the Southeast Asian community. There's a big program of deportation. We also have differential treatment depending on where the immigrant or refugee or political asylee is coming for. It's wonderful to see the outpouring of support for Ukrainians, but let's think about the disparate treatment of other immigrants who are also fleeing political persecution, who are leaving their homeland country, not by choice, but out of desperate measure for their own safety, for their families' survival. how we're treating people from Afghanistan and other countries. So this is something that I think we want to be critical of and be mindful of as well. So because it's Mental Health Awareness Month, I wanted to take a moment to talk about the mental health challenges of our communities. So in addition to the fact that everybody has been hurt by the pandemic, we have our community being blamed for it. And so we had 1 in 5 Asian Americans nationally say that they experienced racism, and that they've actually been more stressed out by the racism than the pandemic itself. We have Asians reporting high rates of depression, anxiety, stress, physical symptoms. And we also see that these are classic symptoms of PTSD. And so this is a period of racial trauma. And of course, again, this isn't just against our communities. We're seeing that for Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities have high rates of trauma. I want to lift up the fact that we have many leaders in the Indigenous community that's raising awareness that there have been many murders and missing of Indigenous women that's been silent, and there has not been enough awareness of that. So I just want to acknowledge again that along with the AAPI community, that we have to also commit to understanding different forms of violence against other communities.
Miss Cynthia, we have a question in the chat box.
Oh, okay.
What are your thoughts on discrimination that happens with the AAPI community, especially the kind that usually stems from adverse relationships history between the countries?
I think the key word was within the API community.
Oh, that there's conflict within the broader community. Oh, yeah. Well, yes. First of all, Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander, that is a label that was created because individually, our power was very small, right, and limited because of our numbers. And so this was a category, a political category, an advocacy category. But within that larger umbrella are very distinct ethnicities, cultures, nations. And so, yes, there have been conflicts. I mean, we are not a monolith. And I think it's very important, for example, that Pacific Islanders may identify more and Native Hawaiians may identify more with indigenous populations because of their experience with colonization and US government relations. So there is conflict. In fact, I just binge watched Pachinko and the story between the conflict between Korea and Japan and the history around that. And that is something, I mean, there can be a series really every day this month on the complex history, but it does exist. And we often point to imperialism, capitalism, colonialism as contributors towards that conflict. And what we try to do is separate governments and policies and actual people and communities. And that's something that I think is really important. Thank you for that question. I know that I did not do a complete, didn't have a complete response, but we almost don't have time to go into the details. But I did want to take a time to talk about the racialization of Asian Americans specifically, because we do want to recognize that in this country, we are in a period of racial reckoning where Asian Americans have been racialized in the same way that Blacks and Latinx, members of the Latinx and Indigenous communities have. I've been knee deep in my book, 1619, And it's been really important to understand that racial constructs have been the foundation of the United States. And that pertains also to Asian Americans, that within the United States, we have created a hierarchy with Blackness on the bottom, whiteness on top. That's really been set up by white supremacist ideology. And so Asians have always been used to be a wedge to suggest that some racial groups, some minority groups are culturally superior or inferior, as the case may be. And if you look at the treatment of Asian Americans, on the one hand, we are a threat, a perpetual foreigner, an outsider. And on the other hand, we are uplifted as the model minority, which I can talk more about that definition. And so this is a reminder that we have always had conditional status, and we've always been used to essentially uplift white supremacist ideologies. And so that's really important for us as a community, as a diverse society, to really understand. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the model minority myth. So it's really important to recognize that the model minority was first introduced during the height of the civil rights movement, when communities of color were coming together in solidarity to fight systemic racism. And so it essentially was a cynical attempt to divide, and especially to pit Asians against other communities of color, to suggest that, again, look at the Asians, they're quiet, they're able to overcome whatever barriers that they might experience, and as a way to deny that structural racism exists. And so this is something that we as a community have fought to reject, simply by the fact that it's not true, in the sense, if you look at income inequality, we have some of the more extreme examples of success, but also extreme poverty. So within the very diverse Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander category, there is a lot of diversity within that, which is why we've always advocated for disaggregating data. Like, we need to get into the details. What are the experiences of Pacific Islanders? What are the specific experiences of Southeast Asians? There is a tendency to center East Asians, and we do need to make sure that, for example, in San Francisco's Chinatown, we have some of the more extreme levels of poverty and overcrowding in San Francisco. And so I think this is something that often gets overlooked with the model minority myth. So I know you can appreciate a good historical timeline, and I'm not going to go over all of the data points, but I wanted to just give you an example that this isn't anything new. In fact, mob violence, blaming and scapegoating, policies that were used against our community, using fear, using racist rhetoric, that denied us our safety, our ability to be naturalized as US citizens, to own land, to live. Again, not just against Chinese specifically, but other Asian groups as well. If you look at the Filipino Repatriation Act, and of course the Asiatic Barred Zone. We also have others more contemporary examples. Obviously, I want to lift up the racial profiling and surveillance of South Asians from primarily Muslim communities, and also the Sikh community. And of course, I have to talk about the Atlanta shootings and the fact that a shooter targeted Asian businesses, targeted Asian women, and how that was framed as really a person trying to address, his sexual addiction, when so many Asian women um, really condemned that framing and spoke out that we have a deep understanding of how race and gender matter. And this was a classic example of that. And we have so many other instances, including the Japanese incarceration in 1942, and how essentially people of Japanese descent were automatically treated as a threat and were placed into concentration camps. But I also want to lift up, because this is also celebrating our history and our contribution, is also how we have been a part of this country's fabric and story, how we have been a part of the civil rights movement, fighting for third world liberation, pushing for ethnic studies, that we have been part of the labor movement, we have fought national security scapegoating. And today we are part of a vibrant movement fighting for our civil rights and our protections. So this is something that I think is really important to lift up, in addition to the injustice and discrimination that we faced. So one of the things that I wanted to lift up here is that how can we address anti-AAPI hate? And so when we polled our respondents, we actually wanted to make sure that we polled our Pacific Islander respondents as well as Asian Americans. The top 3 responses, you'll be happy to know, is education, that we really need to do a better job of addressing all the different ways that we are socially conditioned to have bias, to fear others. We also saw that people supported community-based solutions to safety and enforcing our civil rights. So we were really happy to see that, because of course that is what Stop API Hate is focusing on. And which is why we do a lot of talks, and especially ones that reach the community. So what I want to do is just offer some takeaways. So racial discrimination affects all Asians and Pacific Islanders, so intersectionality matters. We are also part of the LGBTQI community. We are women, we are non-binary, we are also part of the disabled community. So we do look at the specific intersections. Most hate incidents are not hate crimes. So we're trying to look at the best way to address anti-Asian hate, and it's going to take lots of different strategies and solutions. And there is no one profile of who's causing harm. And so we believe that we've got to tackle this as a whole of society. We need all of us, including our libraries, to help with addressing hate in our communities. And then finally, while a lot of our data focuses on interpersonal, what we want to keep pointing to is that it's systemic. And we have to look at the fact that our policies basically reinforce systemic racism. And this is something that we have to be equally committed to as well. So I think that is it from our end, or my end. And I didn't know if we wanted to just open it up to questions. But again, I just want to thank you for the opportunity just to share.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you, Cynthia. I don't know if anyone else wants to start off with questions, but I definitely have a few. Anybody want to start out?
It's all you, Victoria.
Oh, someone wrote in the chat box, I'm remembering Norman Mineta, who was a trailblazer and died this week. Oh, thank you for bringing that up. Yeah. So I learned a lot today in this short time. So I want to thank you personally um, for taking time to educate your own self and really understand so that you can share it with us. So I appreciate your passion. One thing that you mentioned, which I had never heard of before, was racializing. I've never heard that word. So can you speak about that word and about scapegoating?
Mhm.
Racialization, yeah, and scapegoating.
Yeah, so the racialization of Asian Americans is basically acknowledging that race in America has always been a construct, a social construct. And so over periods of time, we have been viewed as the bad immigrant, the good immigrant, that we actually don't belong. And you can actually see in the kind of racist rhetoric used against us that there is a sense that we actually don't belong here, that we are not a part of this fabric.
Mhm.
So it's just acknowledging that at different times in our history, we have been scapegoated and racially profiled. So I want to just harken back that, you know, the city of San Jose recently apologized for its role in discriminating against Chinese and other Asians. But this was the practice, especially on the West Coast. The West Coast, it's really hard to believe because we have some of the largest AAPI populations in the country. It was also the center of the anti-Asian movement. So if you think about in times of fear, whether it's economic or in times when we were at war with Asian countries, um, here in San Francisco, there was a bubonic plague in the 1900s, early 1900s, and they quarantined Chinatown and blamed Chinese. So there's actually a specific through line. And at that time, think about what was happening. We were basically painted as filthy disease carriers, that we were a threat to people's livelihoods. So we had unions actually comprised of immigrants from other European countries, saying that we were also taking away their jobs, right? Even though many were recruited here to work doing dangerous jobs on the railroad and so forth. So that's what I mean by the racialization. And also the scapegoating, that continues to be the case. And you see that rhetoric happening to this day.
Um, we many of us here that work in the family learning centers have adult learners where English language learners, right? So English is not their first language. Some of them come over and like after 2 months they're in our classes, right? So this is like their really first opportunity to practice English. So what would you say as instructors of these classes, or we work with volunteers who instruct, that we can share with these students or give these students to empower them? And I say that because I find myself spending time, you know, teaching them the importance of their voice, right? And speaking and sharing. So any tips or suggestions that you would have for those who are teaching English language learners from Asian Pacific backgrounds?
Yeah, I love that question so much. You know, something that I've heard over and over again from students and also people who perhaps are speaking out for the first time is that how important and meaningful it is for people just to acknowledge that this is happening, to name it. because there has been a sense that they have felt unseen and invisible for so
Yeah.
long. So just that mere acknowledgement, I think libraries and those who work with families directly can be a wonderful resource in terms of, like, right now there's a dangerous effort right now to ban books. And so I think ways in which you can offer, I know this is something that every library is doing, is curating books um, uh, that reflect their experiences,
Mhm.
I think are important, and also offer resources to local community groups so that they can get support, whether it's mental health support or other types. But even just the mere acknowledging and saying, I see you,
Mhm.
and how can we be of help? I think that goes a very long way. And any partnerships you have with local community-based organizations, again, mental health being one of them, where to go if they're being harmed, whether it's racially motivated or motivated because they're trans or LGBT or anything. Those are really important, because I know you often function as like social workers, connecting them to resources too. Yeah.
No, that's very true. Anyone else have any questions, comments, thoughts?
I think Ellen in the chat is asking, is this happening less often now than 2, 4, or 5 years ago?
Well, we only started tracking these incidents starting in March of 2020, and there were other reporting centers. But what I saw with that, their numbers were about 100 a year. And there could be lots of different reasons, including the fact that many people don't know to report, even though we provide opportunities to report in multiple languages. Um, so, and also I feel like what we get is over, close to 11,000 incidents, that this is an undercount of what is actually happening on a daily basis. So I can't comment to, prior to 2 years ago when we were tracking, but what I can tell you is that it's not going away. We continue to receive reports, and we have more reports in 2021 than we do in 2020.
Out of curiosity, Cynthia, do you collect age
Dude,
demographic? Yeah. How often do older people report that kind of thing? I know from my own experience that uh, it's less likely to happen. So,
yeah, so about 7% of our respondents are elderly. And I do agree that that may likely be an undercount. I just think about my own mother, who is afraid of computers. She never uses one. Um, and so, I mean, I think just even reporting and just the culture of like, should I report? Will it make a difference? Is another thing. So there's a digital divide. There's also reluctance or hesitancy, even though we're a community-based organization and we commit to people's privacy. There's a reluctance, right? We have many parts of our community that don't have trust of government agencies and even nonprofits, just because of this climate of fear, and also perhaps a sense of what can be done about it, because they endured mistreatment, and that's something that we want to change.
Good point. Any other comments, questions, thoughts?
I have a question, Cynthia. A few years back, probably not that long ago, I attended the AAPI Stop Hate training. Are those still going on?
Um, Which training was that? Was that the bystander trainings?
I think it was the
Oh,
bystander trainings.
oh
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, I believe that they are still doing it. It used to be with Hollaback, and they changed their name. Yeah, they changed their name, and I can't remember what they changed their name to, but I think they are still doing it, and they're offering it in different languages now too. So I think that that's great. And again, I apologize that they changed their name. I think if you Google Hollaback, it might direct you to their new name. But yeah.
Oh, apologies. It was a different organization. For some reason, I correlated the two.
No, that's okay. Not at all. Yeah. What did you think of the training?
I thought they were really great.
Yeah.
Especially coming from a place of like no knowledge about how to support someone as a bystander.
Mhm.
They gave a lot of really great tools and insight. So I really enjoyed it, and I recommended it to anyone who would listen to me.
Yeah. Yeah, it's great. I mean, basically, I think that training is about de-escalation. And obviously, your own safety is of concern and the person who's being targeted. So it's really about de-escalation and centering on the person who's being targeted versus giving anybody who is causing harm attention, right? And so, and then also what I think is really important is to not call the police automatically, because you also have to check in with that person. Maybe they don't want the police call for different reasons. And so I think that that's really important, as well. So thanks for bringing it up.
Yeah. We actually have lovely SJPL staff here, and due to their nature, they actually found the new name of it. So it's actually now called Right to Be. And it looks like we have the URL in the chat as well. So it's righttobe.org, no spaces in between all of those letters.
I expect nothing less. Offer that resources right away.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that, guys. Any
Can I ask a question, Victoria?
Absolutely.
So Cynthia, I was just wondering, kind of awkward, but I really would like to hear your feedback on this.
Mhm.
How do you respond when people put racism and to degrees, and they say there is, more Asian hate now, but it still doesn't compare to what Black people suffer, to the impact and the long-term, I mean, just the devastating impact of that. And so I'm just wondering, because I know that sometimes I myself do that. And I don't want to do that. I don't want to minimize what other people are feeling. So I'm just wondering how you respond to that.
Yeah, well, I appreciate, I mean, that's real talk where, that you're offering up here. One thing that I think is really important, and this is something that I say to my own colleagues who are doing this work, is that for our community, there has been a sense that our issues have never been taken seriously and have gotten visibility. And so you do see a lot of people saying it's about time that the racism that we experience is recognized. And at the same time, it's a both and, right? And so we can't deny that anti-Black racism is real and it's systemic. And so just in the same way that our hearts were broken with the Atlanta shooting, my heart broke into a million pieces watching George Floyd be murdered, before our very eyes. And I have actually been doing, I actually grew up in LA, where police brutality and police violence was just an everyday acceptance. And am a survivor of like the aftermath of the 1992 civil unrest. And so we can do both. We can actually draw attention to systemic racism in all of its forms without denying the realities and that there is a disproportionate impact. So, when I look at the fact that Asian Americans are also harmed by police, but it's at a really different rate. And so we have to acknowledge that. So the racial hierarchy that I showed you in the previous slide, that speaks to the realities of privilege and perception, and the fact that all of those stereotypes, whether it's model minority or to somehow paint one group, including, especially Blacks, as prone to criminality, as being dangerous, as being a threat, all of those serve to divide and harm each of us. And I think that we have to be very cognizant, of that fact. And I myself have been very hyper aware that, which is why whenever I talk about the anti-Asian racism, I lift that up in direct connection with all forms of racism. And that's why it's really important to lift up the issues of intersectionality too. I recognize my privilege as a straight person when it comes to the experiences of trans people. I recognize my privilege as a US citizen when it comes to people who have different immigration status and experience. So this is something that I think, that we're all trying to grapple with. And I really, really appreciate, your question.
Any other questions, comments, or thoughts? Mercedes, would you like to close us and tell us where we can find this video?
Yeah, definitely. On behalf of all the FLCs, Cynthia, thank you so much, as Victoria said, for taking the time out of your day to come and share all of this information with us. Just so that everyone knows, this session was recorded and will be available on the SJPL YouTube page in just a few short weeks, hopefully. You can find that page by going to our main sjpl.org website, scroll all the way to the bottom. You'll find the YouTube icon, and you can click on that to find all the rest of our speaker series that will be taking place for the rest of this month. This is a lovely way to get us started, and please join us again every Thursday in the month of May for all of the rest of our sessions.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for having me. I do really feel like it's my giving back to library and the work that you do, who's given me so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia. We'll definitely be in touch with you for other opportunities of connecting.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Take care.
Okay, have a great day.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody.